We're going to bring companies and jobs in at levels that you've never seen. The only way you can do it is through the threat of tariffs.
In his first few weeks in office, much of President Trump's focus has been on tariffs. He announced and then suspended 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, announced a 10% levy on goods from China effective in March,
Make America great again, right? That's what we care about.
announced tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports from around the world, and then reciprocal tariffs on the entire world as of April.
So when you imposed the tariffs the first time, you added 120,000 jobs. And since that time, it's been picked away and nicked away and excluded away. You're going to bring those 120,000 jobs back to America. You are the president who's standing up for the American steel worker.
Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick says that tariffs would be good for jobs.
Our industry is in the midst of a disruption.
But Ford CEO Jim Farley went to Capitol Hill to tell lawmakers that the tariffs on Mexico and Canada would be a disaster for the U.S. auto industry.
I think longer term is the bigger concern. These kind of tariffs, especially in these two countries, are very significant. And if they persist beyond months, we could see billions and billions of dollars of pressure on the industry, lost jobs, lots of impacts to communities and our ecosystem in the industry.
The Council on Foreign Relations estimates that the U.S. auto industry may be among the hardest hit. So it's no surprise that automaker stocks have underperformed the S&P 500 since President Trump's election, with a pronounced dip since the announcement of tariffs.
If you look at the landscape of the auto industry, it represents about 5% of GDP. It's about $1.2 trillion of activity, with almost in the case of manufacturing and parts, that represents about 2 million workers.
Ellen Hughes-Cromwick is a senior fellow at Third Way and spent much of her career as the chief global economist at Ford before serving in the Department of Commerce under President Obama.
There's no question that tariffs raise inflation.
S&P Global Mobility estimates that the average $25,000 price of a car imported from Mexico or Canada could go up by $6,250 if tariffs take effect. The 50 best-selling models in the U.S. market account for about 60% of the market volume, half of which would be directly affected by the tariffs.
The importer pays the tariff, not the company that's exporting to the United States. So number one, that business has a choice to make. Either they pay the tariff and import the goods, or they begin to substitute away from those imported product and try to find other sources. They could also pass along that increase in their cost because of the import tariff to their end market customers. And it, in general, will just simply raise prices.
The hit the auto producers may suffer from tariffs is already being seen, not only in their stock prices, but in their being less profitable than their suppliers for the first time in 6 years. And RBC calculates that it will be the U.S. producers, GM, Ford, and Stellantis, that will be hit the hardest. Imposing tariffs on inputs to any products made in the United States will increase costs. But in the case of tariffs on auto parts crossing the Mexican or Canadian borders, the problem is particularly acute, given the complexity of the supply chains and the need for parts to cross the border several times over the course of production. Everett Eissenstat served as the deputy director of the National Economic Council under President Trump during the last term, where he has seen trade sentiment go from integrated to protectionist.
So the 25% tariff would have a pretty disruptive impact on the integration that has been ongoing now for a couple of decades. And it would be quite a dramatic shift, I think, if that were to go into effect for a sustained period of time.
One alternative, of course, might be for U.S. automakers simply to source all their parts in the United States. But putting together an automobile is a complex task. Most have tens of thousands of parts. So shifting that process entirely back to the United States is unrealistic, and certainly couldn't be done quickly.
Any assembly of a vehicle that product cycle can be 3 to 5 years. Now, back into the supply chain and look at a tier 3 supplier. Hundreds of these supplier businesses have to then start to think, okay, well, what investments do I have to make in order to supply that part to Ford Motor Company, for example?
What makes it worse for auto companies is that they are not working with substantial margins to begin with, which makes fundamental changes in the way they produce that much more difficult.
There's enough excess capacity to generate a very competitive industry with, when you look at many of the companies with very thin profit margins. And if you, for example, say, okay, I want to be more resilient for this particular component going into my vehicle, but if I dual source or decide I'm going to try to source over a few different suppliers, I'm going to be adding cost.
The U.S. auto industry has a long history of reckoning with federal national security and trade policy.
One, you had the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was designed to enable the U.S. auto sector to compete with China and other markets that were starting to produce manufacturing at a much reduced cost. And the idea was you could create a North American supply chain that would make the U.S. competitive, that would enable the exports to continue from the United States. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which was something that President Obama had negotiated, which was one of the last efforts to really bring integration at the highest levels among many economies. That agreement was panned pretty badly by both then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, but also soon-to-be President Trump. That was really the end of the integrative effort for the United States. So this kind of shift away towards integration, just-in-time delivery, towards a more unilateral trade approach has been brewing for quite some time. Now we're into an acceleration of that unilateral trade pattern. So it's a trajectory that's been ongoing for a while. I think it will be ongoing for quite some time.
The higher costs and disruption that the threatened tariffs represent for U.S. automakers come to an industry already struggling to deal with a massive transition to electric vehicles. GM committed to shift 50% of its fleet to EVs by 2030, but delayed plans for a new electric Buick last year, citing lower than expected EV adoption. Policies under the Biden administration, namely the Inflation Reduction Act, attempted to support EV adoption, but the Trump administration is now saying it will pull back on those initiatives.
When you have situations where policy moves back and forth, and you saw it most recently, under President Biden, you had a lot of incentives to go to electric vehicles. And with the emissions requirements, it really almost forced them to produce a certain type of vehicle. Now you've got an administration with a very different perspective that is not as focused on those emission standards, that actually is putting a different type of pressure on the industry. It takes time to adapt, and I think it puts a lot of pressure on the ability to plan a long-term trajectory for the industry, and at some point that's going to be impactful.
Now, if you pull the rug out from under that brand new industry with thousands of jobs, we're basically making all that capital investment just way inefficient and wasted. And that isn't really a way to run the country either. I mean, we want to support businesses to be competitive and to grow and to create jobs. We don't want to destroy wealth by penalizing companies that made those investments over the last several years. And I think, that's just a misguided business policy approach.
While the U.S. goes back and forth on its commitment to electric vehicles, the rest of the world moves ahead, with U.S. EV adoption largely flatlining since hitting the tipping point of 5% of new car sales in 2021. But wherever the government ends up on tariffs or on EV incentives, the one thing that is certain is that for the industry to thrive, it needs the certainty that it is not getting.
We need to remember that the U.S. auto industry doesn't sit in isolation. We're part of a global economy. And there's a lot of other actors in the world, and while we may wish that we had the auto industry we did in the early ages and the U.S. was completely dominant, The reality is there's a lot of other players in this sector now. There's a lot of other countries that have very, very productive, robust automobile exports. And I hope there are ancillary policies that come into play that enable the industry to make the kind of adjustments they're going to need, both with capital investments and to make sure they're able to get the technology they need here in the United States, the workforce they need in the United States, the ability to get products and regulations, to move quickly in getting facilities up and running, because you can't wait a year or two for everything to be perfect. You got to constantly be running in this industry.